So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled 20th Century Fiction. We'll start with a new text today, James Joyce's Ulysses. We just finished Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, and we'll see how this particular novel also corresponds to Mrs. Dalloway in very similar stylistic ways. But before we dive into the text, which we will obviously in due course, we'll spend some time, and this lecture will be spent entirely in terms of looking at some of the features of modernist fiction. We've done a fair bit of modernist fiction by now. We've done Heart of Darkness, we've done Eliot's early poetry, we've done The Wasteland, we've done the short story by Joyce, Araby, and of course we've done Mrs. Dalloway. So I think most of us have a fair idea of how the narrative techniques in high modernist writing operates. But Ulysses, being one of the cult works of modernism, is one of the most representative texts of modernism. So I think it is worthwhile to spend a little bit of time, maybe a session, which is what we're going to do now, talking about how the entire modernist narrative experiments are constructed and designed. Now, one thing which we find is a bit of a recursive feature in modernism, or modernist writing, high modernist writing, is the entire technique of stream of consciousness. What is stream of consciousness? Now, obviously, it means quite literally the way the thought processes work in the mind, right? So the way thoughts associate one to each other and form an entire chain of associations, which is sometimes logical, sometimes rational, and sometimes affective in quality, affective. So some of the stream of consciousness technique operates by affective association principles, right? So one thought latches onto another thought as some kind of a chain of effect, and that's how the entire stream of consciousness operates. Now, to put that into writing, that's obviously a very difficult thing. It's a very complex thing because the entire thought processes, as you know, those of us, we experience it almost every day. When we think of different things together as some kind of a chain, we find that sometimes there's no causal connect between thought A and thought B. So thought A can end in the middle of the narrative and then latch itself onto a new thought which might come as a trigger. So you might see something around you which might trigger you to think about certain things, and then you have a different trigger which takes you to a different kind of thought. So in a way it is all connected, but at the same time they're not quite causally connected. There's no neat cause and effect relationship between thought processes. That's how we experience the entire experience of thinking every day. Now, modernism is one of the earliest, probably the first literary movement which really wanted to systematize human thought processes into language, right? So obviously we've had different writings at different eras of time where the focus has been on the human mind, the human thought process, the human memory, etc. But we find this becomes almost an obsession with modernist writing. This becomes almost a system of writing in modernism, where to depict how the human brain thinks, how the human mind thinks, becomes it almost becomes the central theme of modernist writings, right? So sometimes you find that the story gets buried under the thought processes or the entire efflorescence of thought, right? So the fluidity of thought, the flow of thought, the entire and the flood of thought processes, that becomes a story essentially. So there's no really story beneath the thought processes. And when you come to Ulysses, you find that to be a spectacular example of that. There's not a lot of things which happen in Ulysses. It's just about one day in Dublin. Just like Mrs. Dalloway was about one day in London. And despite that, we have this one calendar day, one historical day, one stretch of clock time. But inside the stretch of clock time, inside that window of clock time, inside that parameter of one calendar day, we have multiple narratives in operation, and sometimes in conflict, sometimes connected to each other, to different nodal points. And the nodal points could be characters, so character in narrative A can also be character in narrative B. The nodal points can also be spaces. So one narrative can intersect another narrative in a certain space, and that's why the metropolis is such a fascinating example of this kind of, such a handy site for this kind of a narrative technique, because the metropolis offers all these different channels of intersection. If you think about any metropolis, whether it's London or Dublin or Mumbai or Calcutta or Madras, we find that each metropolis has different nodal points, different intersections, different places where people come in and intersect and go away to different directions. So those nodal points are very much a spatial entity, a real spatial presence in any metropolis. So the city becomes a very handy site for this kind of a modernist technique of stream of consciousness and hyperlinked narratives, because the city offers the actual geographical, physical place where nodal points are necessary and where nodal points exist. So characters in one point, characters in one story can very feasibly connect to characters in another story through different sites of intersection. So Ulysses offers such a fascinating example. I mean, it is quite possibly the most famous modernist novel. It is also quite infamous in its own day. It was banned for a long time in different parts of the world, especially in the United States of America, where it was banned until the 1960s, I think. And the two main charges against this novel were, it's quite absurd when you think about it, because the one charge was obscenity, of course. I mean, that would be a very commonplace charge against any book which is banned. It is supposed to be obscene, it is supposed to be profane, religiously profane, etc., culturally profane, morally profane. But the other charge was more interesting. That charge was obscurity, right? So obscurity obviously meant that it was difficult to read the book. It's obscure. I mean, its meaning is not very clear. Now that obviously makes it a bit of a paradox. I mean, if it's obscure, then how do you know it's obscene, right? So in order to know it's obscene, you must be able to read it, right? So obscurity would actually undercut the entire claim of obscenity. But this is one of the novels which which produces paradoxes like this throughout history. And Joyce at various points had told that he wanted to put in so many riddles inside Ulysses that professors across the world would struggle to decipher and decode the meanings, right? So that would be like he's sort of implanted different jokes in a narrative in a way which would be almost difficult and impossible to decode. Now the obscenity paradox in Ulysses, it is just a pointer to some of the more important paradoxes in a novel, because when you start reading the novel, which we will from the next session, we find that this is a novel about one day, as I mentioned. This is a novel about very ordinary people. But as the very title suggests, Ulysses is obviously an epic, there's an epic structure, an epic substructure, or a superstructure, whatever you call it, that a novel is very superficially adhering to. So it's also a journey novel, just like Ulysses, the original Ulysses. Homer's Ulysses was coming back from somewhere, and his wife was having many suitors, his wife was having many visitors, many lovers, and he wasn't aware of it, and he was coming back. The entire story was about homecoming. And Telemachus was obviously his son. So we have a similar kind of a structure where Leopold Bloom is the character, the protagonist in Ulysses, if we can call one person the protagonist. Molly Bloom is his wife, and we have Stephen Dedalus. Those of you who read Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by Joyce would know that that is a novel where he appears for the first time. And he's obviously a more grown man. He's obviously someone who wants to make it big as an artist, as a writer in Dublin. So he becomes the quasi-son-like figure for Leopold Bloom. I mean, Leopold and Molly Bloom, they don't have any children on their own, biologically speaking. So, Stephen Dedalus becomes the quasi-son character, the quasi-Telemachus character in this novel. And it's interesting how the original Ulysses' journey across the mighty seas, across sirens and monsters and different kinds of storms and winds, is replicated at a very structural level by Leopold Bloom's travels across Dublin, the city of Dublin. And obviously there's no comparison to be made at all between the stormy seas of the Homeric Ulysses and the very, very messy and dirty streets and lanes of Dublin that Leopold Bloom inhabits. But that is precisely the point. So this is what Eliot had described as Joyce's mythic method, in the sense that the mythic method is a technique where a certain myth is used, structurally speaking, and then a story sort of seems to conform to that mythical structure, but obviously in a very different setting, obviously with very different characters, with very different sentiments, right? And oftentimes the mythic method may be used to flatten out certain grand narratives about homecoming, flatten out certain grand narratives about nostalgia, about nation, about love, etc. So mythic method by Ulysses, by Joyce in Ulysses, more often than not, it becomes a technique through which the grandiose character, the original myth, is flattened, is deflated. The significance, the mythic significance is deflated in this particular novel. Right? So the mythic method is a structural replication of an original mythical journey, of an original mythical action, which is replicated at a very superficial structural level. But beneath the structural superficial adherence, there is very little that is carried over or in resonance in terms of sentiments. And the sentiments, if they're similar at all, similar sentiments with the original myth, the sentiments in this new text, more often than not, turn out to be more cynical, turn out to be more exhausted, turn out to be more flattened, turn out to be more deflated in quality. Right? So there is a degree of deflation in mythic method, especially in the way that Joyce uses it. So one could say that Ulysses by James Joyce could be seen as a mimicry of the Homeric Odyssey. It's very shallow mimicry. So in that sense, it's quite postmodern in quality. And it's one of those novels which is obviously is very modernist in quality in terms of stream of consciousness, in terms of the use of space and time, in terms of the interiority. So everyone's talking about emotions and thoughts and memory and inwardness and interiority in that sense. But also, it is quite postmodern in its centerlessness, or rather in its celebration of centerlessness. So it doesn't really mourn centerlessness, it actually celebrates centerlessness. And if we come to a later work by Joyce, which is Finnegans Wake, we find that it's entirely postmodernist in quality, in the sense that it's entirely anarchic. It becomes a text of bliss, as Roland Barthes would call it, a writerly text, a text which is open for interpretations, a text which which cannot be read as a reader, which cannot be consumed as a reader, which can also be participated in as a writer, right? That's the distinction that Roland Barthes had made between the readerly text and the writerly text. Readerly text is something which you can read as a reader. It's got a close quality, hence it's readerly in quality. It's called readerly in that sense. A writerly text, on the other hand, is something which you can only participate as a co-writer, something that you can be an active creator, a co-creator, even when you're reading it. Now, Finnegans Wake is entirely that. Now, Ulysses shows signs of such postmodern experimentation in language. We have entire passages which are completely onomatopoeic in quality, just sounds, different sounds put together without any meaning whatsoever. But what those passages do, in a very interesting sense, is that it gives Ulysses a sense of immediacy. So it becomes very automatic in some sense, it becomes very immediate in some sense, and it becomes a very immediate capture of reality. So the different sections in a novel where we have tramcars coming in and going, so the tramcars of Dublin coming in, screeching in and going. And instead of describing the tramcars, we have sections which just mention the sounds of tramcars, screeching sounds of tramcars, halting sounds of tramcars, the ugly sounds of tramcars, the sonorous sounds of some tramcars, right? So that obviously gives a more authentic depiction of tramcars movements in Dublin. So in that sense, it becomes very automatic text. It becomes a very immediate text. It becomes a very immediate capture of reality, a capture of consciousness, so to speak, which is the other point that I wanted to come to, the whole idea of consciousness. So how is consciousness represented in Ulysses? And obviously, consciousness is a very fluid phenomenon. It's not really a static or monolithic concept. It's not something which is passively consuming reality around it. Consciousness, on the other hand, in Dublin and Joyce's Ulysses, is very much an active process. It's a process of becoming, unbecoming, and rebecoming. It's a very fluid phenomenon, consciousness, rather than a static category which has just some investments in meaning. So we find the different characters in Ulysses, whether it's Lupa Bloom, or Molly Bloom, or Stephen Dedalus, or different other characters who come and go, the minor characters, the major characters, and of course Dublin itself becomes a character, the city itself becomes a very important character, very significant character in this novel, as it was in the case of Araby, which atrocity we read from Dubliners. We find that each of these characters, they always foreground their consciousness, they always foreground their thought processes, right? And thought processes become very, very important in that sense, because it's not so much about the action, it's not so much about moving from point A to point B, it's about the interiority of movements, it's about the entire depth, the additional dimension, the third dimension in movement, rather than just a lateral dimension from point A to point B. So in that sense, Ulysses is not really a novel about action, it's a novel about different kinds of thought processes, which in turn becomes action. So in a sense, it's like an X-ray of human consciousness, where it basically foregrounds what is supposed to be inside, right? The inside being the interiority of the human mind, the interiority of the human consciousness, the interiority of the human memory processes. All those processes, all those methods are now externalized in Ulysses, and that becomes the character, that becomes the landscape, the tabula rasa of the novel, so to speak. So there are two different landscapes that play with each other. There's Dublin, there's a real landscape, the real geographical landscape in Ulysses. There's also the different minds of the characters which form a landscape, because they are constantly foregrounded in a way that becomes very, very external and exterioriated. So this entire externalization of interiority is something which makes the landscape very, very mental in quality, very psychological in quality, right? So you might say it's a mindscape. So the mindscape of the different characters, which is a stream as well as a string of consciousness, is in very close correspondence to the landscape of Dublin, the very dingy, messy, mutable landscape of Dublin. And that brings us to the other point of mutability in the story. We find that this is a story about changes happening all the time. Changes in thought processes, changes in memory, changes in sentiments, changes in bodily functions. We have lots of bodily functions in Ulysses. There's a lot of defecation happening in Ulysses. We have Leopold Bloom defecating in the very beginning of the novel. There's a lot of description of digestion, indigestion, consumption of food, and of course defecation. So it becomes, and this is part of the scandal that it generated in that point in time. In a sense, it foregrounded the internal bodily function. It wasn't trying to sublimate the body into a romantic category. It was trying to give a very earthly description of the body as a very earthly activity, the body as activity, the body as a fluid phenomenon. Again, like consciousness, a very fluid phenomenon, something which consumes, digests, has indigestion, something which defecates. So all these activities become very much part of the central story of Ulysses, the different bodily functions, which was, as I mentioned, part of the scandal of Ulysses as well. So the human body in Ulysses becomes very much a volatile phenomenon, a mutable phenomenon, like the mutable metropolis. So you find the human figures, the human body, the human activities, carnal activities, consumption activities, all this become part of the landscape as well. All this becomes part of the story as well. So in that sense, Ulysses becomes very much a mutable, volatile, velocity-driven narrative about human memory, consciousness, and thought processes in a very, very messy and mutable Dublin. So in that sense, it becomes a very city story, a city which also becomes a character, characters which also become the city. So in that sense, space and human mind blend into each other in very, very complex and cognitive and organic ways in Ulysses. Which brings us to the other point of organicity. So as I just mentioned, a lot of organic movements happen in Ulysses, including sexual movements, digestive movements, defecation movements, and consuming movements, etc. But all these movements, obviously, they are normally classified as body movements, B-L-W-D-Y. Carnal, something which is related to sexuality, consumption, something related to eating, defecation, something related to the, very, very dirty, filthy bodily functions. And you find all these different movements are connected in a way which makes the entire landscape of Ulysses very, very mutable in quality, as I just mentioned. And mutability is a very, very constant phenomenon of the metropolis. And that obviously makes it very, very organic, which is a point that I'm trying to stress over here. So the organicity of the city and the organicity of the human movements are blended into each other in Ulysses to create this almost carnivalesque landscape of organs, of organic activities, organic waste. And waste is obviously a very important function in Ulysses. We have a lot of litter in Ulysses, a lot of waste products, human waste, organic waste. So you have a lot of food wasted, human bodily waste, of course, which comes from defecation, litter in terms of using paper, which is stale, using paper to do certain very, very, earthly, bodily, disgusting, filthy functions, etc. So filth and defecation and waste and trash. So all these come together, all these are foregrounded constantly in Ulysses. And you find that this is obviously a big scandal given the time in which this was written. This is very Catholic Dublin, very conservatively Catholic Dublin, and obviously the religious hold on Dubliners was still quite strong. There's a lot of sexual morality at play, a lot of religious morality at play, and we found that how that obviously created confusion in the minds of characters and the minds of people who inhabited the landscape, as we saw in, for instance, in Araby, the short story, where the boy who's obviously having a lot of erotic impulses, a lot of sexual impulses towards Mangan's sister, but he cannot articulate it. He cannot bring himself to talk about it. He cannot bring himself to acknowledge it. So he wants to sublimate it into some kind of religious rhetoric of devotion and Platonic worshipping, which obviously is not the case. But when it comes to Ulysses, we find that all these bodily, carnal, sexual, volatile functions are foregrounded in a way which becomes very, very quote-unquote immoral in quality, right? So that completely undercuts any restrictions which is imposed by morality, religious morality, sexual morality, Catholic morality. So all these are done away with entirely in Ulysses. And as a result, what we have is a very carnivalesque quality of human bodily functions, organicity, immediacy, automatism. So all these become, very importantly, are very complexly blended to each other. So the tramcars, the movement of tramcars blend with the movements of the human body, the rhythms of the city blend with the rhythms of the human sexual impulses. So all these different blending ends happen at different points of time in Ulysses, which makes it such an organic novel, such an organically volatile and automatic and available and earthly and tangible novel in that sense. as a result of which we find it so relevant even today, because it talks about certain things that are universal in quality, right? It talks about emotions, it talks about sentiments, it talks about bodily desires, it talks about bodily needs in that sense, and all these are put together in a very realist way. So in that sense, Ulysses, despite using stream of consciousness, despite using certain very experimental narrative techniques, is actually very, very grounded in reality. Now, which brings me to the final point of today, with which I'll come to an end in this lecture. Whenever we talk about realism, we have this assumption of realism being realistic. But of course, nothing can be further from the truth, because realism is a narrative device which entails, which presupposes an omniscient narrator, a narrator which knows everything, a narrator who has control of the entire characters, entire action of the novel, and a narrator who's telling you a very close narrative in a sense of having this absolute knowledge about what's happening in the characters' minds, what's happening with the characters' lives, what's happening in the before, now, and after. So the omniscient narrator in a realist novel, in realism-driven novel, has complete control, complete cognitive control over the temporality and the spatiality of the narrative, in terms of knowing exactly what's happening in a spatial sequence, in terms of knowing exactly what's happening in a temporal sequence. But of course, we know that nothing can be further from the truth when it comes to real life. Because real life, obviously, is not predictable. Real life, obviously, we don't have any control in terms of space and time. Space and time are always changing in real life, and we have, the entire beauty and complexity and tragedy of real life is its unpredictability in that sense. So in that sense, the stream of consciousness technique, or the technique that Joyce uses in Ulysses, is entirely unpredictable. It actually foregrounds the unpredictability, the mutability of human mind, the mutability of human lives, and in that sense, it's actually more real, way more real than any realism-driven narrative technique. And that is the one point that I wanted to sort of foreground today, in a sense of, undercutting some of the myths about realism. There's nothing real about realism at all. Realism is an artificial narrative technique which presupposes an omniscient narrator who has complete control and complete knowledge over the time, space, before and after, of the entire activities and the entire minds of all the characters in the novel. In other words, a realist narrator, a realism-driven narrator, is basically a god. It presupposes a godlike presence, a godly and godlike presence over the narrative. Ulysses, in that sense, is a godless novel, because there's no control over the space and time. The human beings move in very mutable combinations, very complex combinations, very random combinations that crisscross each other at different points of time. They have bodily needs, they have sexual needs, they have carnal needs, they have different kinds of appetites, and all these appetites are foregrounded in a way which makes it very, very real, in the sense of being bodily and automatic and lived. So in that sense, Ulysses is about experientiality. It foregrounds and celebrates experientiality in a sense of being human experiences and the way it is experienced, the unpredictability of experience, the mutability of experience, the embodied quality of experience is what is celebrated and foregrounded over and over in Ulysses. And so that's the premise, that's the stylistic, thematic, and narrative premise of Ulysses, which I want to talk a little bit about today. And for the next class, we'll dive into the text. Obviously, we can't read it in its entirety for practical purposes. We'll select certain passages from the text, which we'll highlight and study in some details in due course of time. So we'll start with the text for the next lecture. We end this lecture today, hopefully having given you some background of the narrative technique, some background of the cultural conditions, some background of the literary traditions which informed this great novel by James Joyce. Thank you for your attention.